Among the 19th century abolitionists, John Brown stands apart. Ever since this failed wool merchant turned guerrilla fighter plunged from a scaffold in Charlestown, Virginia, now West Virginia, Americans have grappled with the question of how his life and legend should be remembered. He has been deified and demonized in equal measure. One popular framing device among historians and history educators, especially here on YouTube, is to ask whether John Brown was a hero or a terrorist. While there's nothing inherently wrong with that framing, this video, and this series as a whole, is aimed at people for whom that's not really a worthwhile question. On this episode of The Abolitionists, we'll be concerning ourselves far less with John Brown the martyred symbol, and more with John Brown the living, breathing activist. Was he a foolhardy captain who led his men to certain death at Harpers Ferry, into a steel trap, as Frederick Douglass put it? Or was his strategy for revolution far more sober than most historians have traditionally given him credit for? Oh, hey, Karl from InRange. What's up, man? What are you doing here?
Oh my God, are you doing a video about John Brown? Based. Do you know what I say about arguing with people on the internet nowadays?
What do you say about arguing with people on the internet nowadays?
Don't argue with anyone John Brown would have shot.
Oh wow, that's really cool, man.
You know, John Brown did nothing wrong.
Well, he did do the Potawatomi massacre and murdered like 5 innocent people in front of their kids. That seems pretty wrong to me.
General Sherman did do one thing wrong.
Deliberately orchestrate the genocide of Plains Indians?
No, he stopped in Georgia. He should have kept going.
Look, man, in a lot of progressive spaces, especially online, complicated historical figures and events often get memeified into really simplified versions of themselves. Enough history to fit in 1 or 2 lines of text. But I think this does a disservice, not only to the public's understanding of history, but also to the activists of today's liberation movements, who could glean a lot of concrete strategies and tactics from the historical record if only they knew where to look.
Wait. Are you trying to say that pithy internet comments that trivialize horrific acts of violence might actually not be good history or activism?
Perhaps.
Well, you know what? We're not going to learn anything about John Brown's raid sitting in front of this dope backdrop. Why don't you come with me?
Oh, come where? God, making a mess. By 1858, the abolitionist guerrilla army of Captain Osawatomie John Brown had cut a swathe of blood and destruction across Kansas and Missouri, freeing the enslaved, killing their oppressors, and capturing the imagination of the entire American abolitionist movement. Though Brown's exploits in Bleeding Kansas are by far his most dramatic and memorable, it's hard to overstate just how far his reach as an activist in the late 1850s was. His fame allowed him to ingratiate himself with the leaders of the movement, like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Delany. And he had secured regular funding for his anti-slavery crusade from the shadowy cadre of wealthy New Englanders known as the Secret Six. The lives of the entire Brown family revolved around anti-slavery activism. John had relocated the clan to a remote farm near Lake Placid in New York's Adirondack Mountains, where a number of free black homesteaders had also congregated to distance themselves from the prevailing racism of American life, to become self-sufficient, and to cede their own sovereignty. Though the old man was rarely at home, the farm provided an important refuge both for his sons, more often than not fugitives from the law, and escaped slaves who could utilize the home as a base before completing their journey to Canada and freedom. But all this was small potatoes compared to Brown's ultimate ambition. As early as 1847, in an early meeting with Frederick Douglass in Springfield, Massachusetts, Brown laid out a detailed plan for the destruction of American slavery by revolutionary force. As Douglass would later recount in his autobiography,
he called my attention to a map of the United States and pointed out to me the far-reaching Alleghenies.
"These mountains,"
he said,
"are the basis of my plan. They are full of natural force, where 1 man for defense will be equal to 100 for attack. They are full also of good hiding places, where large numbers of brave men could be concealed and baffle and elude pursuit for a long time. I know these mountains well, and could take a body of men into them and keep them there, despite all the efforts of Virginia to dislodge them. The true object to be sought is first of all to destroy the money value of slave property, and that can only be done by rendering such property insecure. My plan then is to take at first about 25 picked men, and begin on a small scale. Supply them with arms and ammunition, post them in squads of 5s on a line of 25 miles, the most persuasive and judicious of whom shall go down to the fields from time to time, as opportunity offers, and induce the slaves to join them, seeking and selecting the most restless and daring. Imitating the Haitian revolutionaries and the countless maroon communities across the Western Hemisphere, the abolitionist army would then swell their numbers with escaped slaves, and through systematic sabotage and guerrilla warfare, make the peculiar institution of slavery economically untenable down the Appalachians, from Maryland to Alabama, one county at a time. When Brown returned east from Kansas for the last time in the winter of 1859, accompanied by a battle-hardened band of gunfighters, he had finally gathered enough steam to put his long-time plan into action. He set his sights on the Federal Armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, a veritable treasure trove of all the firearms a Revolutionary Army could ever want. Here, Old Man Brown planned to bring ruination down onto the slave owners of Virginia, just as he had to the slave owners of Kansas and Missouri. The Old Dominion, the birthplace of American slavery, would now be privy to the beginning of the end, and Brown would fill every slaver in the country with what he himself described as holy horror.
So the infiltration of Harpers Ferry began more than a year before the raid, in June of 1858. John Brown sent John Edwin Cook out here to ingratiate himself with the community. In doing so, he lands up renting the Kennedy Farm, which was inconspicuous, off the road, and was a place for doing his planning. Now, John Edwin Cook couldn't have been any more different than John Brown. He was a womanizer. In fact, he landed up impregnating a woman named Virginia Kennedy in the local area and marrying her and having a child with her in the process of actually planning this raid. In fact, he became so friendly with the community, he befriended Colonel Lewis Washington, descendant of George Washington, actually got into the plantation and found and saw George Washington's actual weapons stored there and marked him as a potential hostage. In fact, one of the plans was to determine local community leaders that might make good hostages for the raid. Many historians have made light of John Cook's personality and sort of said that his extroversion might have been a deficiency. But in reality, I think you could argue that it actually was very productive for the cause because no one in the community suspected anything about it, up to and including marrying a woman and having a child in the process. His wife actually had no idea about why he was actually here and had to eventually tell her what was going on when John Brown and the rest of the abolitionist army suddenly showed up at the Kennedy Farm. She, by all accounts, actually kept the secret and was part of the abolitionist cause by that process, if nothing else by dedication to her now husband. So I think what's interesting about John Edwin Cook is that you couldn't contrast him any more against John Brown. John Brown being a pious religious man, John Edwin Cook being a womanizer, having sex in the community and being an extreme extrovert is an example of how, while John Brown is frequently referred to as a religious zealot, which I think we can say he was much more of an abolitionist zealot because he was willing to work with whoever he had to who was truly dedicated to the abolitionist cause. And I think John Edwin Cook is an excellent example of that.
John Brown, his sons Oliver and Owen, and his second-in-command John Kagi arrived in Harpers Ferry on July 3rd, 1859, carrying wagon loads of crates marked household goods and hardware and casings, which were in fact full of weapons. Later that month, his daughter Annie and daughter-in-law Martha, who were teenagers at the time, also joined them at the Kennedy Farm. The abolitionists hoped that the girls' presence would make it seem like a large family lived at the farm and avoid suspicion that a large number of single men might otherwise cause. It was a tense and claustrophobic few months as the abolitionists made their final preparations for the raid. Annie was the group's watchdog, as her father put it, basically a lookout who would stay at the porch and deal with neighbors if they came asking questions. The Browns also had a watchdog of a more literal sort, a mutt named Cuff, who no doubt did good work warning the abolitionists of many a stranger's approach. The men of the abolitionist army, a hodgepodge collection of escaped slaves, wealthy, college-educated New Englanders, and Kansas Jayhawkers, all shared cramped accommodations in the attic, living a nocturnal existence. Annie referred to her father's men as her invisibles, and described life at the Kennedy farm as like standing on a powder magazine after a slow match had been lighted. One day, when John and Annie Brown were at church and there was no lookout on the porch, one particularly nosy neighbor just strolled right into the Kennedy farm to find three men of John Brown's army, including one black man, which is a very suspicious sight at the time. The abolitionists lived in constant fear of this particular woman, who tended a garden in the back of the Kennedy farm. She was constantly over with her small children, and it seemed only a matter of time before she figured out what was going on and reported them to the authorities. But despite the close calls, the people of Harpers Ferry remained totally oblivious to the abolitionist plot. Brown went to enormous lengths to maintain secrecy, not even sharing the details of his plan with his own men until he absolutely had to. Probably a good idea considering the maddening indiscretions of John Cook and others. As Richard Realf, an associate of Brown's who helped plan but did not participate in the Virginia campaign, would later put it,
John Brown was a man who would never state more than it was absolutely necessary for him to do. Not one of his most intimate associates, and I was one of the most intimate, was possessed of more than barely sufficient information.
Though Brown's reticence about the plan was certainly shrewd, at some point he would need to share the details with his men, which he finally did in August. Opinion was sharply divided about Brown's strategy, and for a moment the future of the campaign was in perilous doubt. But eventually the men rallied behind their leader. The revolution would begin with an attack on the armory. Not long after, Brown spilled his secrets yet again, this time to his old friend Frederick Douglass. The two arranged to meet in secret at a stone quarry near Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Brown held nothing back, divulging the full plan, and famously begged Douglass to come along with him and fight alongside him. But Douglass refused, saying that the men were going to die at Harper's Ferry, that they were going into a, quote, perfect steel trap. He prophesied that they would all be massacred. Sadly, he was right. Many historians' retelling of this event frame Douglass as coolly rational and wild-eyed Brown as reckless and deluded. But Douglass's own account of this meeting in his autobiography contradicts this framing. His retelling of the story is wonderfully frank and brutally self-castigating, as he openly wonders whether his discretion is a mask for his cowardice. With the benefit of hindsight, he seems genuinely disappointed in his cautious decision. In this same chapter of his autobiography, Douglass reprints the text of an article he wrote on Halloween 1859, in which he freely admitted that,
"My critics may be perfectly right in denouncing me a coward. I have not one word to say in defense or vindication of my character for courage. I have always been more distinguished for running than fighting, and tried by the Harper's Ferry insurrection test, I am most miserably deficient in courage."
Summer gave way to autumn, and final preparations for the raid were put in place. The abolitionists were suffused with fresh cash from a wealthy new recruit from Massachusetts, sorely needed money, which was quickly spent on primers and percussion caps. At last, on October 15th, 1859, John Brown informed his army that the war to end slavery would begin the following night. Opinion about the raid's chances of success were still split, but the men's dedication to the cause was unshakable. For all their well-recorded flaws and eccentricities, the men of John Brown's army all shared the most important quality a freedom fighter can have, a quality Frederick Douglass evidently lacked: a willingness to fight and die for what they believed in.
Let's talk about some of the weapons used here in the Harpers Ferry raid and the ramifications of that thereafter. This right here is a reproduction 1863 Sharps carbine. Of course, the raid was in 1859, and John Brown was armed with 1853 Sharps carbines. It is without irony to note that John Brown started the war for abolition with a Sharps carbine, and the Union forces, an abolitionist army, used 1863 and 1859 Sharps carbines as their premier breech-loading weapon throughout the war. If you want to know more about the Sharps carbine, how to use it, the paper cartridges, the gas leak issues, the development of the gun, or how these guns got into Bleeding Kansas and into John Brown's hands through a preacher named Beecher, check out my video on InRangeTV. Now, John Brown had a plan, a tiered plan for the weapons that were here. There were over 100,000 weapons here at Harpers Ferry Arsenal, and he came with the best weapon of the time. In 1859, this breech-loading carbine was the premier technology of its day, and it was why he armed his abolitionist rebel army with these guns. Now, these were going to be the guns of the officers, and when his abolitionist army formed, these were the men leading the fight. Weapons like this, which is a 1842 smoothbore musket, were the kind of weapons that were here stored at Harpers Ferry Arsenal. This one's in relic condition, but it's representative of what that weapon is. These weapons were going to go to the second tier forces, the men that knew how to use a gun, but didn't necessarily rate, from an officer perspective, for a Sharps carbine. And last but not least, while this is a military-style socket bayonet, 1,000 pike heads were manufactured by a blacksmith in Connecticut, smuggled down here into Virginia, and they were going to arm the rest of the people that didn't know how to use a firearm. So John Brown was inspired by a man named Francisco Javier Mina, who was a Spanish guerrilla fighter in 1810. And the idea that a small band of fighters could start the spark and the fire that would turn into a large revolutionary army had historical precedent. And that's what John Brown and his abolitionist fighters were trying to do here in Harpers Ferry. Brown had a very particular way about how he wanted this army to be organized, and he wrote this just before the raid. A company will consist of 56 privates, 12 non-commissioned officers, 8 corporals, 4 sergeants, and 3 commissioned officers, 2 lieutenants, a captain, and a surgeon. The privates shall be divided into bands or messes of 7 each, numbering from 1 to 8, with a corporal to each, numbered like his band. 2 bands will comprise a section. Sections will be numbered 1 to 4. A sergeant will be attached to each section and numbered like it. 2 sections will comprise a platoon. Platoons will be numbered 1 and 2, and each commanded by a lieutenant designed by like number. So that sounds like a national army. It's not without irony to notice that John Brown was himself a secessionist. He was planning to form a free abolitionist country, a state, a nation state, within the Appalachian Mountains. He helped write a constitution in Chatham, Ontario, which was a stronghold of freed black refugees that had gotten there via the Underground Railroad, some of them based on John Brown's previous actions himself. So this constitution was collectivist and militant. It had a number of principles. Principle 1, all confiscated goods and material were to be held in common. Principle 2, everyone was to labor for the common good of the community. Principle 3, the open carry of firearms was encouraged. Had the raid at Harpers Ferry gone the way John Brown had envisioned, everything was in place to form a free nation of abolitionists and an abolitionist army.
On the night of October 16th, 1859, the abolitionists departed from the Kennedy farm and began their fateful procession here to Harpers Ferry. Osborne Anderson, the only black survivor of the raid, left an obscure but detailed account of everything that transpired next. According to Anderson, Brown ordered his men to walk 2 by 2 along the road, some distance apart. 2 other men went ahead to tear down telegraph wires along the route. Brown impressed upon the men to make as little noise as possible. A protocol was established to detain any person they had met along the road until the whole army had passed by. It seemed like Old Man Brown had thought of everything. Anderson makes special note of an express order Brown gave to his men, that absolutely no one was to be harmed except in the direst circumstances of self-defense. Tragically, 2 hours wouldn't pass before they disobeyed this order. Coming to the Maryland side of the Potomac, to the far end here of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge, of which only ruins remain, and actually right now I'm standing on the new bridge right along the Appalachian Trail as it passes here through Harpers Ferry. The abolitionists stopped on the other side of the river to take their weapons out of concealment and arm themselves to the teeth. Then they began to proceed across this bridge to begin their infiltration of Harpers Ferry. Oh.
The abolitionists made their way to their first objective, the armory. Right behind me here, this is now a rail grade, but this all would have been flat and level with what you see the town behind me. But this monument is where the actual engine house stood. It is now 150 feet away in that direction. But on that night, the abolitionists infiltrated the armory and actually took the arsenal without a shot fired. They plucked passerbys off the street, turned them into hostages, and they now, without any violence enacted, controlled 100,000 weapons. Just up the Shenandoah River, John Coggy and other abolitionists had actually taken control of the rifle factory itself. Behind me would have been the arsenal where they stored the weapons, but he was now also in control of where they made the weapons. According to Anderson's account, the local black residents of Harpers Ferry heralded the abolitionist raid as liberators, and in fact, at least one black woman spoke to them and said she had been praying long for their arrival. Anderson himself, with 2 black abolitionists, came across other black men at Harpers Ferry who enthusiastically joined the cause. Another group went to Lewis Washington's plantation, freed his slaves, took him as a hostage, and seized George Washington's weapons per John Brown's direct orders. Up until this point, they now were in control of Harpers Ferry Arsenal and the rifle factory, had some prominent hostages, had George Washington's weapons, and had local black men joining the cause. Up until this point, everything was going swimmingly and seemed to be exactly aligned with John Brown's plan.
But back at the B&O Bridge, Brown's well-laid plans were starting to unravel. Around 1 a.m., a train arrived in Harpers Ferry from Baltimore, and the conductor, noticing that there were no lights on the bridge, got out with some of his crew members to investigate. The abolitionist sentinels of the bridge then apprehended the railmen at gunpoint, ordering them to halt where they were. One of the railmen, a black porter named Haywood Shepard, refused to obey the order. Spooked, one of Brown's men fired his Sharps rifle. A bullet passed into Shepard's back and then popped out of his chest right below his heart. He was dragged to a nearby railroad office where he soon bled to death. According to Anderson, the abolitionists couldn't make out Shepard's race or his clothing in the dark and just assumed that he was an armed hostile. Anderson actually defends his comrades in his account, saying that Shepard's, quote, movements were such as to justify shooting him. A tragic accident made bitterly ironic by the oft-repeated fact that the first casualty of John Brown's war to free the slaves was an innocent black civilian. We do not know what Haywood Shepard thought of slavery or abolitionism, but this has not stopped generations of slavery apologists, such as groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and Sons of Confederate Veterans, from speaking for him, appropriating his life and death for cynical use in white supremacist propaganda. This monument to Shepard, erected in 1931 by the SCV and UDC, is just such an example of this myth-making. It frames Shepard as an exemplar of, as they put it, faithful Negroes who, despite, quote, many temptations, remained true to their enslavers. The fact that the monument gets Shepard's name wrong, referring to him as Hayward rather than Haywood, I think shows just how little these groups actually care about this man or his memory. Perhaps these neo-Confederate groups wish to provide a, from their point of view, positive contrast to the black men of John Brown's army, who, in the pre-dawn darkness of the 17th, were raising hell.
So as the sun rose on the morning of the 17th, John Brown was firmly in control of the arsenal, the armory, and John Brown's fort. The local community found themselves to be in a state of siege and outraged and disturbed by the fact that not only was their community under fire by abolitionists, some of their own slaves had joined the cause. They armed up and walked right down this street, to my left, your right on the camera, to try and defend their community. But they were powerless in stopping John Brown. Brown and his men had taken up good positions with good equipment and were able to hold them off. John Brown spent much of the morning coordinating the removal of weapons from the arsenal to wagon loads to be taken across the river, as well as negotiating with some of the local community for release of some of the hostages that they had in the fort. The wagons coming back were tardy, and the delay of removing the weapons from the arsenal, as well as these negotiations, caused delays in the raid, and they lost their inertia in the raid, which made a number of the abolitionists concerned about their ability to eventually get out of here. As Anderson remembered in his account,
this tardiness on the part of our brave leader was sensibly felt to be an omen of evil by some of us, and was eventually the cause of our defeat.
Despite all the care Brown had taken to cut telegraph wires leading into Harpers Ferry, he allowed the train to continue on. In fact, looks like there's a train continuing on through Harpers Ferry as we speak. There there it goes. The train brought news of the raid to the surrounding countryside. The news was spreading like wildfire, and soon, militia companies from all over the region began heading to Harpers Ferry. The first militia company arrived at around noon, coming across the B&O Bridge from the Potomac side. They advanced in columns, and the abolitionists took their positions around the armory. When the militia had gotten to about 60 yards away, Brown ordered his men to start shooting. Not expecting such stiff and organized resistance, the militia scattered and fled back onto the B&O Bridge. Bleeding militiamen lay strewn all over the streets. And in just a single flash of gunfire, the violence of the raid had increased exponentially. The shootout quickly devolved into panicked chaos. One civilian, firing from a window right around here, took aim at Dangerfield Newby, a formerly enslaved abolitionist who was going through this alley behind me. The man had loaded a 6-inch iron spike into his muzzle loader. He took aim at Newby and fired. The spike tore through Newby's neck, opening such a large gash that, as one witness described, you could probably get the better part of a foot inside it. Another witness, who went on to be a Confederate soldier, stated years later that he had never seen a gunshot wound that horrible, not on any of the battlefields of the Civil War. But Newby wasn't killed outright. He lay in the street, gasping for air, a shocking amount of blood gushing from his neck, before finally expiring. It was too dangerous for any of his comrades in the engine house, now known as John Brown's Fort, to rescue his body. Instead, drunk civilians and the racist mob that was forming would use his corpse for target practice throughout the subsequent battle, and dogs and pigs were seen eating his corpse. This alley has been known as Hogg's Alley ever since.
This is the engine house. The engine house is where the local fire department would store their supplies and their wagons for fighting fires. They're fire engines, as such. And this is where John Brown ultimately got pinned down. Firing holes have been bored through the doors. The abolitionist, armed with actually superior weapons in terms of the sharps, exchanging fire back and forth. This is a furious firefight. Windows are shattering. Bullets are hitting the bricks. John Brown's son, Oliver, died in this firefight. At this point, realizing they're pinned down and this is a desperate situation, the abolitionists called for John Brown to negotiate with the militia and the racist mob outside. The slaveholding states and the men that had slaves had for long realized that the possibility of this sort of insurrection was real. This was their ultimate fears manifest and realized right here in Harpers Ferry. At this point, realizing that this was happening in their own town, their own community, they were enraged. They were beyond negotiation. John Brown sent his son Watson Brown out in an attempt to negotiate, realizing that they were really pinned down and had no other options. Watson came out waving a white flag, but the mob in its wrath could not be assuaged, and they fired on him anyway, wounding him, and he landed right here in front of the fort, leaving John Brown and his men no choice but to have a last stand.
The situation was, simply put, a disaster for the abolitionists. Though at least 24 local black men had joined John Brown's army, it wasn't nearly enough to make a difference. And as the tide of battle turned decisively in the slavers' favor, the likelihood of local slaves risking everything to join the revolt dwindled more and more. Brown and the better part of his army were trapped in the engine house, surrounded on all sides by militia and a mob of armed racists. John Kagi and his detachment over at the rifle factory had already been overrun, and all but one of them had been shot and killed when trying to flee across the river. Meanwhile, the group of abolitionists, including John Cook and Owen Brown, who had been tasked with bringing wagon loads of weapons to a rendezvous point on the Maryland side of the Potomac, found themselves trapped on the other side of the river, with a company of militia on the B&O Bridge between them and their besieged comrades. Concluding that the situation was hopeless, this group abandoned the mission and fled north. Later that night, United States Marines under the command of Brevet Colonel Robert E. Lee arrived in Harpers Ferry, together with a young lieutenant named Jeb Stuart. Lee cut quite a different figure in 1859 than he did in his Civil War days. He hadn't turned gray yet, and he was still in his sort of cute little Vincent Price mustache phase. But in any case, federal troops arrived to the relief of the racist mob and took their positions around the engine house. John Brown's little army was surrounded.
None other than Robert E. Lee, commanding the force of Marines, sent Jeb Stuart to come negotiate with John Brown at the doors to my right. He said that the clemency of the government would be given if they would surrender. John Brown replied that he knew what that meant. He meant it was the hangman's noose, and they said, "No, we're not interested in your clemency." Jeb Stuart said, "I'll come back in the morning and we'll negotiate further." And they spent a long, hard night waiting in here thinking about their fate. A hostage later remembered that John Brown's men were so resolute that as they spent the night in this fort, they just calmly reloaded and cleaned their weapons, preparing for the fight the next day. And this is when John Brown realized that his real service was to die a martyr for the cause, and that in doing so, he would actually have a potential victory much greater than he could have ever have imagined in his original plan. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Jeb Stuart came to the door as he said he would and asked them for the decision. The abolitionists answered that they would rather die than surrender. He took off his hat and waved it, which was the signal, and the Marines attempted to storm the doors. They came up with hammers and started beating on the doors. But the abolitionists had moved the fire engines against the doors, and these doors were not budging. They were even firing from the ports above them, but they could not fire down at the Marines that were beating on the doors. At this point, the Marines realized they needed a better way to get in. They found a local ladder, turned it into a battering ram, and started bashing the door with this ladder. They didn't actually beat the doors open, but they bashed a hole in it large enough for at least one man to enter. Lieutenant Green, one of the Marines, could fit through and did so armed only with his sword. In an amazing act of bravery, he climbed into this fort filled with men that were ready to kill him, saw John Brown, slashed his throat, and stabbed him so hard that the sword actually bent in half. Other Marines started coming through the same hole and stabbing every abolitionist they could find with their bayonets. At this point, John Brown's men were either dead, mortally wounded, or captured. And it was the end of John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry.
Unconscious and soaked in blood, John Brown was dragged from the engine house and laid on the floor of a nearby armory office. The next day, Jeb Stuart, the governor of Virginia, a senator, and 2 congressmen came into the armory office to interrogate John Brown. He was anxious to speak. The interview lasted for 3 hours. He knew that every word he was saying was being recorded for posterity. John Brown had changed his strategy once again. Sorry, my dog needs to be warm. Since he wouldn't die in battle for the cause, he would now make the case for radical abolitionism plainly to the world. He spent 6 weeks imprisoned, first awaiting trial, then execution. His time in prison was a flurry of letter writing to friends, family, and especially fellow abolitionists as he tried to explain and justify his actions to the broader movement. The slaveholding South uniformly reacted to news of the raid with the unbridled rage and terror that they always felt toward servile insurrections. But the political climate of the 1850s gave rise to another emotion, smug vindication, that the professed moderation of anti-slavery Northerners belied a deep-seated and hostile fanaticism. As the Petersburg Express, a Virginia newspaper, put it,
"The Harpers Ferry affair is but a small eruption on the surface of a diseased body. Brown and his desperadoes are but a sign of the cancerous disease of abolitionism with which a great part of Northern society is polluted by the traitorous views of men who have been raised to honor and surrounded by applause. The Harpers Ferry affair was but premature fruit. A whole harvest of sterner rebellion and bloodier collision is growing up and ripening from the seed these men have sown. Unless a change, a speedy and effectual change, sweeps over Northern society, the great conflict must come."
Henry Wise, the governor of Virginia, expressed a close variation on this theme in an address to the Virginia legislature just a few days after John Brown's death by hanging.
"Abolitionism has established spies everywhere, and has secret agents in the heart of every slave state, and has secret associations and underground railroads in every free state. And since the raid, it has defiantly proclaimed aloud that insurrection is the lesson of the hour. Not of slaves only, but all ought to be free to rise up against fixed government. What is this but anarchy? There can be no compromise with them, no toleration of them in safety and self-respect. They must be met and crushed, or they will crush us, or our union with non-slave-holding states cannot continue. The strongest argument against this unnatural war against Negro slavery is that it inevitably leads to disunion of the states, embittered with all the vengeful hate of civil war."
Though Wise was right to perceive an existential threat to slavery among Northern abolitionists, he was somewhat hyperbolic about its broader support in the region as a whole. In the aftermath of the raid, Northern opinion was very much against John Brown, with many openly questioning his sanity. One of his only defenders was the Massachusetts radical Henry David Thoreau. In a speech delivered in his hometown of Concord, Thoreau asked his audience to consider whether the points that John Brown had made during his interrogation, a transcript of which had been widely printed, could possibly be the ramblings of a madman.
Read his admirable answers to Mason and others, how they are dwarfed and defeated by the contrast. On one side, half brutish, half timid questioning. On the other, truth, clear as lightning. What if Massachusetts and the North sent a few anti-slavery representatives to Congress for of late years, to declare with effect what kind of sentiments? All their speeches put together and boiled down, and probably they themselves will confess it, do not match for manly directness and force, and for simple truth, the few casual remarks of crazy John Brown on the floor of the Harpers Ferry engine house.
When Robert E. Lee's Marines raided the Kennedy farm and discovered a trove of incriminating documents detailing the abolitionist plan, the future Confederate wrote off Brown's strategy as ill-conceived and crazy. Though they lacked Lee's mind for military matters, the politicians who had actually interrogated Brown felt very differently. According to Clement Vallandigham, one of the congressmen who had been in Harper's Ferry that day,
it was among the best planned and executed conspiracies that ever failed.
Though Brown likely doomed himself, tarrying in the engine house on the morning of the 17th, his plan was not deluded or irreparably flawed. On the contrary, it was cold-blooded, meticulous, and informed by years of practical experience guerrilla fighting in Kansas and Missouri. But the lack of immediate, overwhelming support from the enslaved people of Harper's Ferry, together with the chaotic unpredictability of violence as a political strategy, ensured that John Brown's plan to form a guerrilla army was over before it could begin. Nonetheless, as Brown's situation in Harper's Ferry became desperate, then hopeless, he never lost sight of his ultimate goal. Instead, when he realized he couldn't start the war to end slavery through the barrel of a gun, he changed tack and used his speech and his ideas, weapons with a longer range than any rifle. And partially due to his actions here in Harper's Ferry, the war did come, a war John Brown knew he would never see. And when the smoke cleared, the slaves were free.
Although Andy and I are really just internet edgelords, we very, very occasionally actually get off our asses and do some real activism. So as you can imagine, this topic's pretty near to our hearts and we have some personal thoughts about it.
Yeah, even though The Abolitionists is my most political series, kind of paradoxically, I think it's the least appropriate place for me to insert my own opinions. So we're going to do a companion video to this one, where essentially we, in that classic Atun-Shei InRange collaborative style, have kind of a post-episode discussion where we share our own sort of personal interpretations of John Brown's life and work.
That video will be released the day after this one, along with a companion video on InRangeTV with a deep dive about the Sharps carbine.
So if you just want to leave it at that, if you just want to watch this video about, the sequence of events of John Brown's raid, I just want to leave you with these parting questions. First, was John Brown right? And second, and more importantly, was he effective? I don't know. I'm just a history dork. I'll leave the answers to the activists.